In addition to segregation, the Jim Crow era was marked by repeated cases of racial violence and terrorism. Two strategies were critical in maintaining white superiority. One was disenfranchisement through official public policy. The second was the sanctioning of domestic terrorism to, quote, keep African Americans in their place. The 1902 Virginia Constitution, like those in other southern states, institutionalized disenfranchisement without ever using the term race explicitly. Administratively, discrimination was carried out by the local election boards. The Klan had declined for a while, but was revived in the early 20th century. Between 1915 and 1927, it grew to over 8 million members. Many of the high officers were doctors, judges, and church leaders. In 1925, over 50,000 Klansmen brazenly marched in Washington, D.C. in full regalia. The Klan was not just for show. They, other terrorist groups, and unaffiliated vigilantes kept the social structure through terrorism, torture, and murder. African Americans were hanged or burned alive for the most minor of perceived slights to white people. Public officials sometimes attempted to intervene, but most were complicit. The hangings were public spectacles where men, women, and children came to see the torture and murder of another human being. There were about 4,400 lynchings across the South during this period and 300 documented outside the South by the Equal Justice Project. An example is in this photo from Marion, Indiana in 1930. The image is cropped, as it was used by Claudia Rankine in her book Citizen. The cropping takes the focus away from the brutalized men who had been murdered and focuses on the people attending the event. Their faces hauntingly show how normalized racial violence was. The Equal Justice Initiative has an interactive map that illustrates how ubiquitous domestic racial terrorism was across the country and allows you to go in and see very specifically what happened and where as they seek to give voice to those who died at the hands of injustice. In addition to terror directed to individual African Americans, entire African communities were targeted. In 1919, African American men returned from Europe after serving the U.S. military in World War I. They had experienced life differently in Europe than in segregated America. They had found respect and came home after being soldiers and sailors expecting to be treated with dignity. Instead, they were met with resentment, attacked and killed across the U.S. in what became known as the Red Summer of 1919. African Americans were attacked in approximately 25 cities, including Washington, D.C., Houston, East St. Louis, and Charleston. In 1921, the thriving African American community of Greenwood in Tulsa was destroyed by a white mob. In 1923, the African American town of Rosewood, Florida, was completely destroyed by vigilantes and the residents permanently driven from the community. Rarely was anyone prosecuted for such violence against African Americans. Vigilante racial terror remains part of the culture in the United States. On the left is Trayvon Martin, killed by a white Latino vigilante in Florida in 2012. On the right is Ahmaud Arbery, killed by 3 white vigilantes in Georgia in 2020. They are but 2 recent examples of the legacy of white people feeling empowered to confront African American men when they think the men are in a place where they do not belong. As has been the case throughout history, the killer of Trayvon Martin was not convicted, but at least this time, the person did go to trial, even though it was after delays. There were also delays in making arrests in the murder of Ahmaud Arbery. But they were made, and they went to trial. And this time the terrorists were found guilty. Guilty of murder by the state and hate crimes by the federal government. Can these convictions begin to send a message that is reinforced across our public policies that vigilante murder of African American men for being African American in places open to other people is not acceptable?